Richard Lawson possessed everything a man could wish for: wealth, power, and an empire forged through years of ruthless business choices. As a self-made millionaire, he was both feared in boardrooms and envied by those chasing success. Yet, amid his towering fortune, he had sacrificed one precious thing along the way: his ability to care. His golden retriever, Buddy, had once been his faithful companion, always there to greet him with love upon his return home, laying his head on Richard's leg after long, grueling days. But Buddy was now old and, worse yet, blind. His once bright eyes had become cloudy, and his movements had grown slower and more uncertain. Where Richard once found comfort in Buddy's presence, he now only perceived inconvenience. The decision had weighed heavily on him for weeks, and at last he acted. One morning, he drove Buddy deep into the forest. The dog, ever trusting, sat in the passenger seat, his tail wagging slightly. He had no idea where they were headed, nor that the man he loved above all else had chosen to abandon him. Richard parked the car on a secluded dirt road, stepping out and opening the passenger door. Buddy hesitated briefly, sniffing the unfamiliar air. "Go on," Richard said, his voice icy. Buddy cautiously stepped out, his paws sinking slightly into the damp earth. The wind rustled through the trees, strange and unsettling. Richard stood there for a few moments, staring down at the dog who had once been his closest friend. Buddy tilted his head, sensing that something was amiss, his ears twitching as if awaiting a command or reassurance, but none was given. Turning back to the car, Richard closed the door behind him. Buddy whimpered, confused, as Richard started the engine. The dog took a few hesitant steps toward the sound, his tail wagging ever so slightly with hope, but then the car lurched forward. Buddy barked, and Richard pressed the accelerator harder. In the rearview mirror, he saw Buddy take a few steps forward, then stop, his head turning left and right, searching for the only person he had ever trusted. Richard clenched his jaw, forcing himself to look away. It was over. The drive back to the city felt eerily silent. There was no heavy breathing from the passenger seat, and no familiar presence at his side. He reassured himself it was for the best. A blind dog needed care, attention, and patience, none of which he had time for anymore. Back in his penthouse, Richard poured himself a drink, convincing himself he had made the right decision. But that night, sleep evaded him as the image of Buddy, lost in the forest, invaded his thoughts. He tried to shake it off. The dog would find his way, or he wouldn't. Either way, he was no longer Richard's concern. But fate has a way of balancing things. In the forest, Buddy stood in the same spot for hours, his ears twitching at every sound. He whined softly, sniffing the air, in search of a familiar scent. He took a cautious step, then another, the ground uneven with fallen leaves and damp earth. He stumbled but pressed on, his heart racing. Soon the rain began, cold, relentless, soaking through Buddy's fur as he continued forward, unable to discern his location, with no guiding voice to lead him. He was utterly alone. The sounds of the forest were foreign, branches snapping, distant howls from unseen creatures. Panic overtook him, but he kept moving. Hours passed, and soon exhaustion set in. His legs trembled, and his paws were raw from stumbling over sharp rocks and roots. Finally, he collapsed under the shelter of a fallen tree, curling up tightly. The forest was vast, and he was just a blind, abandoned dog. Yet his story was far from over. A few miles away, a man sat by a small fire, wrapping his tattered coat tighter around himself. His name was Sam, a former soldier who had lost everything upon returning from the war. He bore the burden of haunted memories and losses too heavy to bear. Now he lived where he could, under bridges, in abandoned buildings, or out in the wild. When the soft whimpers pierced through the rain, he hesitated. The sound was feeble and desperate, stirring something within him that had long been buried under years of hardship. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously moved toward the sound. That's when he saw him, a soaked, trembling dog curled beneath a fallen tree. Sam crouched down, slowly reaching out. The dog flinched at first, but then sniffed the air, shifting his head slightly toward Sam's hand. At that moment, Sam noticed the milky cloudiness in the dog's eyes. He was blind. "Hey there, buddy," Sam said gently. You alone out here?" The dog whimpered, pressing his wet nose into Sam's palm, and something tightened in Sam's chest. "All right," he murmured. "Let's get you warm." Buddy spent that night nestled against Sam, the warmth of the fire easing his shivering. The following morning, Sam fed him scraps of food, watching the dog eat hungrily. There was something familiar about him, perhaps because Sam understood what it felt like to be abandoned and left behind when no longer deemed necessary. Days turned into weeks, and Buddy began to mend. Sam worked with him, guiding him through sound and helping him navigate his surroundings. Despite his blindness, Buddy continued to trust humans, faithfully following Sam, always listening and learning. Months later, in a city distant from the forest, Richard Lawson sat on a bench, his clothes no longer tailored, his face etched with stress. His empire had crumbled. A business scandal had destroyed him, and those he had trusted abandoned him the moment his fortune evaporated. As he sat staring at the ground, he heard something, a familiar panting, the soft padding of paws against pavement. Looking up, he was struck with recognition. Walking beside a scruffy-looking man was Buddy. Richard's breath caught in his throat. The dog looked healthier than before, his fur clean and his body strong. His blind eyes held no confusion, only certainty, and he walked with confidence, guided by the man at his side. Richard stood, heart pounding. Buddy, the dog, paused and lifted his head slightly, but there was no spark of recognition, no wagging tail. Sam looked at Richard with an unreadable expression. "You know him?" Richard swallowed hard. He was mine." Sam's face hardened then. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him. What could he say? That he regretted it? That he wanted him back after abandoning him? But Buddy sniffed the air and then turned away, walking on with Sam. Richard watched them leave, a deep emptiness settling into his chest. He had lost everything, but seeing Buddy walk away, strong and unbroken, made Richard realize that this was the greatest loss of all, the loyalty he had abandoned. Now, loyalty had abandoned him. The moral of this story is that loyalty and love should never be discarded when they become inconvenient. Those who forsake true companionship for selfish reasons may one day find themselves abandoned by the world. True wealth isn't quantified by money or success, but through kindness, compassion, and the relationships we nurture. Ultimately, the way we treat others, be they people or animals, defines who we truly are.